The fluorescent lights of Boston General Hospital's administrative wing hummed with sterile authority as Dr. Kenneth Morrison signed Diane Porter's termination papers without looking up. His Mont-Blanc pen scratched across the dismissal form with the casual indifference of a man who'd ended dozens of careers before breakfast, each signature as meaningless as the last. The 52-year-old hospital director barely registered the cleaning lady standing in her faded blue uniform, her callous hands clutching a mop handle like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Behind him, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Boston Harbor, the morning sun glinting off the water like scattered diamonds, a view that cost a hospital more per square foot than most people earned in a month. Rebecca Walsh, his girlfriend and the hospital's chief of surgery, stood beside his mahogany desk with her arms crossed, her designer heels clicking impatiently against the Italian marble floor. "Ms. Porter, your employment at Boston General is terminated effective immediately," Kenneth said, his voice carrying the bored efficiency of someone reading a grocery list rather than destroying a woman's livelihood. He finally glanced up, his steel-gray eyes sweeping over Diane with the same clinical detachment he'd used to evaluate a broken piece of equipment, something to be discarded and replaced without a second thought. Rebecca smirked, her perfectly manicured hand resting possessively on Kenneth's shoulder, the 15-carat diamond on her finger catching the light like a weapon. Diane's jaw tightened, but she said nothing, her dark eyes holding secrets that neither of them could begin to imagine. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words and the ghost of a future that was about to change all their lives forever. 3 months later, Kenneth would stand in the same office, surrounded by federal prosecutors and the smoldering ruins of everything he'd built, and remember the way Diane Porter had looked at him in that moment. He'd replay her silence, searching for the warning signs he'd missed, the clues that the quiet cleaning lady had been documenting every lie, every fraud, every unnecessary surgery that padded the hospital's bottom line, while elderly patients died on operating tables they never should have been on. But that morning, as he handed her the termination papers and watched her walk away without a backward glance, Dr. Kenneth Morrison had no idea that the woman he just fired would become the most important person in his life. He didn't know that her shabby uniform concealed a Wharton MBA and a decade of FBI service, or that her meticulous mind had already assembled enough evidence to bring down his entire hospital system. All he knew was that Rebecca wanted her gone, and what Rebecca wanted, Rebecca got. At least, that's what he believed until the day the handcuffs clicked shut. Hello, my friends. Before we continue our story, leave your like, share the story, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. Dr. Kenneth Morrison's life existed in the rarefied air where money and power intersected with the godlike authority of life and death. His corner office on Boston General's top floor was a temple to success. Original Rothko paintings, leather furniture that cost more than most cars, and a bar stocked with scotch older than his medical degree. He'd built the hospital's reputation from a struggling community institution into a $2 billion healthcare empire, expanding into 3 states with cutting-edge cancer centers and cardiac wings that attracted patients from around the world. Every morning, he arrived at 6:30 in his black Mercedes S-Class, parking in his reserved spot marked Director in gold letters that caught the sunrise. But success tasted like ashes lately, a hollowness he filled with 16-hour workdays and Rebecca's expensive company. At 52, Kenneth should have felt triumphant. He was exactly where he'd planned to be since his first year at Harvard Medical School, surrounded by luxury and wielding influence that made politicians return his calls. Instead, he found himself staring out at Boston Harbor during board meetings, wondering why none of it felt like enough. Rebecca told him he was having a midlife crisis, laughing as she suggested a yacht or maybe a vacation home in Aspen to cure what she called his existential nonsense. He'd almost believed her, because believing her was easier than examining the gnawing emptiness that grew stronger every time he signed off on another hospital acquisition. Rebecca Walsh was everything a successful man was supposed to want, brilliant, beautiful, and ambitious enough to match his own drive. They'd met 5 years ago at a medical conference in Chicago, both of them presenting research papers, both of them recognizing in each other the same hunger for the top. She was 43 but looked 35, maintaining her appearance with the same ruthless efficiency she brought to the operating room. Her surgical skills were undeniable. She transformed Boston General's neurosurgery department into one of the most profitable divisions in the hospital system. Patients flew in from Dubai and Singapore specifically to have Dr. Rebecca Walsh perform their spinal surgeries, paying premium rates that made the hospital board members practically salivate during quarterly reviews. What Kenneth didn't see, what he'd trained himself not to see, was the coldness beneath Rebecca's charm. She treated nurses like servants, berated residents until they cried, and spoke about patients as revenue streams rather than people. When he suggested she might soften her management style, she'd laughed and kissed him, whispering that weakness didn't build empires. She'd moved into his Beacon Hill townhouse 2 years ago, redecorating it in minimalist whites and grays that made the space feel like a luxury hotel rather than a home. Her clothes filled his closets, her colleagues filled his dinner parties, and her opinions filled the space where his own thoughts used to live, pushing out the man he'd once imagined he'd become. That morning's board meeting had been typical. Profit margins up 12%, patient satisfaction scores carefully managed, expansion plans approved with unanimous votes from board members who owed their seats to Kenneth's political maneuvering. He presented the quarterly numbers with his usual confidence, watching nodding heads and imagining his father seeing this moment, finally proud after decades of disappointment. The old man had wanted Kenneth to join his family practice in rural Vermont, treating farmers and factory workers, never understanding his son's ambition to build something greater. Kenneth's success was the ultimate revenge, proof that he'd been right to leave, right to choose prestige over service, right to climb until the view made everyone else look small. Rebecca had been waiting in his office after the meeting, already irritated about something trivial that turned out to be a cleaning lady. That woman is always lurking in patient rooms, asking questions, taking too long to empty wastebaskets, Rebecca complained, pacing in front of Kenneth's desk like a prosecuting attorney. She gives me the creeps, Kenneth. She watches everything with those beady little eyes, writing things in a notebook like she's investigating us or something. Kenneth had barely been listening, distracted by emails from the hospital's legal team about some routine complaint, but he'd learned that agreeing with Rebecca was easier than arguing. Fire her, then, he'd said absently, signing the termination authorization without reading it, without asking questions, without wondering why his girlfriend would care enough about a cleaning lady to interrupt his day. Now, as evening painted Boston in shades of amber and gold, Kenneth sat in his office nursing his third scotch and feeling that familiar emptiness expand like a black hole in his chest. Through his windows, he could see the lights coming on across the city, millions of people living lives that probably made more sense than his, finding meaning in things smaller and truer than quarterly profits and board approvals. Rebecca had left for a conference in Los Angeles, kissing him goodbye with distracted affection before climbing into a car service that would take her to Logan Airport. The silence in his office felt heavy, pressing down on him with questions he'd spent his entire adult life running from. Questions about whether building an empire was worth it if you ended up ruling over nothing that mattered. His phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca, a photo of her in first class with a glass of champagne, and the caption, "Missing you already." Kenneth stared at it for a long moment before setting his phone face down on his desk, the gesture feeling more symbolic than it should. He thought briefly about the cleaning lady from that morning, Diane something, wondering vaguely where she'd go now, whether she had a family depending on that meager paycheck he'd just eliminated with a careless signature. Then he poured another scotch and pushed the thought away, because Kenneth Morrison hadn't built a $2 billion hospital system by worrying about people who couldn't keep up, people who got in the way, people whose names he'd forget by morning. Diane Porter's alarm went off at 9 p.m., pulling her from 3 hours of restless sleep into reality of another night shift. She lay in her modest Dorchester apartment, staring at the water-stained ceiling and doing the mental math that had become her nightly ritual. Bills due, groceries needed, her son's therapy costs mounting like interest on a debt she'd never escape. The termination from Boston General had come 3 months ago, and despite her best efforts, she hadn't found another night position that would let her be home during the day. Her savings account, once healthy from her FBI years, had dwindled to triple digits, and she was 2 weeks from decisions she'd sworn she'd never face. Which bills to skip, which meals to stretch, how to explain to Noah that his routine might have to change. The apartment was small but clean, every surface scrubbed spotless from her years of working night shifts in places people didn't want to see. She'd moved here 5 years ago when she left the FBI, choosing Dorchester for proximity to Noah's special school and the affordable rent that came from living in a neighborhood other people dismissed as rough. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen with appliances from the 1980s that still worked if you knew their quirks. Family photos covered 1 wall. Her wedding day before everything fell apart, Noah as a baby before the diagnosis, her graduation from Wharton when she believed the world would recognize her brilliance and reward it with opportunities that never materialized the way she'd imagined. Noah was already awake in his bedroom, organizing his action figures in precise rows, counting them under his breath with a ritualistic intensity that calmed his anxiety. At 9 years old, he functioned differently than other children, autism spectrum disorder with sensory processing challenges that made the world feel too loud, too bright, too unpredictable. He needed structure, routine, specialized therapy that cost $200 an hour even with insurance, a mother who could be present during his difficult moments rather than sleeping while strangers managed his care. Diane had made the choice 5 years ago to step away from her career as a forensic accountant with the FBI's healthcare fraud unit, sacrificing prestige and purpose to be the parent her son needed, the parent her ex-husband had refused to be when he'd walked out 2 weeks after the diagnosis. She pulled herself from bed and went to Noah's room, where he immediately looked up with his father's green eyes, the only thing her ex had left him besides debt and abandonment. 37 action figures, Mom. 37 exactly, he announced, his voice carrying that flat effect that other people mistook for lack of emotion, even though Diane knew he felt everything more intensely than most people could imagine. She sat beside him on the floor, breathing in the familiar scent of strawberry shampoo, feeling the weight of maternal love that was simultaneously her greatest joy and her deepest source of terror. That's exactly right, buddy. You want to help me make dinner before I go? She didn't go anywhere anymore. Hadn't since the termination, but maintaining his routine meant pretending, acting as if her life hadn't imploded, protecting him from anxiety he didn't need. The kitchen ritual unfolded with familiar comfort. Noah measuring ingredients with scientific precision, Diane cooking mac and cheese because it was cheap, and he'd eat it without complaint. They didn't talk about money or worry, existing instead in this bubble of normalcy where the only thing that mattered was getting the pasta to cheese ratio exactly right. Diane had once analyzed billion-dollar fraud schemes, tracking money through offshore accounts and shell corporations with instincts that made her legendary within the FBI's white-collar crime division. She graduated from Wharton at the top of her class, recruited directly into the bureau, spent a decade building cases that sent executives to federal prison for decades. That life felt like it had happened to someone else, a character in a story she'd once read, but could barely remember. The truth was more complicated than her termination paperwork suggested, more painful than the humiliation of being fired by a man who'd never bothered to learn her name. Diane had taken the cleaning job at Boston General 18 months ago out of desperation, night shift that let her be home during Noah's school day, physical work that was mindless enough to not remind her of everything she'd lost, a paycheck that barely covered rent but was better than nothing. What she hadn't expected was how quickly her trained eye would spot the patterns, the irregularities that screamed fraud at anyone who knew what they were looking for. Elderly patients scheduled for complex spinal surgeries they didn't need, Medicare billing that didn't match actual procedures, deaths attributed to complications, when the medical records showed preventable errors covered up by falsified reports. She documented everything in the notebook that had gotten her fired, dates, times, patient names, billing codes, conversations overheard, while she emptied wastebaskets that executives assumed she was too stupid to understand. Diane Porter, the cleaning lady, was invisible, dismissed, beneath notice, which meant she heard things that would never be said in front of someone they considered important. Dr. Rebecca Walsh had been the worst, bragging to colleagues about her surgical volume without mentioning that half her patients hadn't needed surgery, that she bribed primary care doctors to refer Medicare patients for procedures that enriched her while destroying lives. Diane had watched it all, recorded it all, and when she'd been fired for asking too many questions, she'd taken everything she collected and called her former supervisor at the FBI. The federal investigation had been open for 2 months now, with Diane serving as a primary confidential witness, while surviving on the thin buffer of her savings and Noah's Social Security disability payments. The prosecutors had been stunned by the scope of her evidence. 18 months of systematic documentation that painted a picture of institutional fraud so brazen, it made even seasoned investigators pause. Boston General wasn't just billing Medicare fraudulently. It was performing unnecessary surgeries on vulnerable patients, covering up deaths to maintain accreditation, and operating a kickback scheme that funneled millions to doctors willing to participate. Diane's evidence was meticulous, irrefutable, and about to explode into public view in a way that would destroy everyone involved. Tonight, she sat in her small kitchen after Noah had gone to bed, reviewing documents on her laptop, while eating the leftover mac and cheese that constituted her dinner. The FBI raid was scheduled for next week. Dawn arrests, search warrants executed simultaneously across 3 hospital locations, her testimony delivered to a grand jury that would indict at least 7 doctors, including Rebecca Walsh herself. Diane felt no triumph, only exhaustion and a grim satisfaction that the system she'd once believed in still worked sometimes, still punished the predators who thought their expensive degrees and influential friends made them untouchable. She thought about Dr. Kenneth Morrison's face when he'd fired her, the casual cruelty of his indifference, and wondered what he'd look like when federal agents walked into his corner office with handcuffs and headlines. The summons to Kenneth's office had arrived via certified mail, hand-delivered by a federal marshal with an expression that suggested he'd seen this movie before and knew how it ended. Kenneth had been reviewing surgical schedules when his secretary buzzed him, her voice tight with barely concealed panic, announcing that federal prosecutors were in the building and requesting his immediate presence in the conference room. His first thought had been some routine compliance issue. Hospitals dealt with government inquiries constantly, paperwork disputes that lawyers handle with billable efficiency. His second thought, arriving with the cold clarity of dawn breaking over disaster, was Rebecca and the way she'd been avoiding his calls from Los Angeles and the nervous energy that had consumed her in the weeks before she'd left. The conference room was crowded with people in suits, their faces carrying that particular blend of professional courtesy and predatory satisfaction that prosecutors wore when they knew they had you cornered. Assistant U.S. Attorney James Chun introduced himself with a firm handshake that felt like it should have been accompanied by Miranda rights, gesturing to the woman beside him with words that made Kenneth's blood stop. "This is Diane Porter, our primary witness in the case we're about to discuss." Diane sat at the conference table in a Navy business suit that looked nothing like the cleaning uniform he'd seen her in 3 months ago, her posture straight, her eyes meeting his with steady composure that contained not triumph but something worse, disappointment in who he'd turned out to be. "Dr. Morrison, you're not being charged at this time, but I need to make the situation clear." Chim began, opening a briefcase that seemed to contain Kenneth's entire professional life reorganized into evidence of crimes he hadn't known he was enabling. Boston General Hospital is facing federal charges for systematic Medicare fraud, unnecessary surgical procedures resulting in patient deaths, and obstruction of investigations. We have 18 months of documentation from Ms. Porter, who served as a confidential witness while employed as a custodial worker at your facility. Kenneth's mind refused to process the words, stuck instead on impossible. The cleaning lady he'd fired for being in the way was a federal witness, had been investigating them, had evidence of crimes he didn't even know were happening in his own hospital. Diane finally spoke, her voice calm and professional in a way that felt like being slapped with velvet. "Dr. Morrison, I worked at Boston General from March 2023 until you terminated me on June 15th. During that time, I documented systematic Medicare fraud primarily orchestrated by your chief of surgery, Dr. Rebecca Walsh. She performed over 200 unnecessary spinal surgeries on elderly patients, billing Medicare for procedures they didn't need, paying kickbacks to referring physicians, and falsifying medical records to justify her surgical decisions. 17 patients died from complications of surgeries they should never have had, and those deaths were covered up in mortality reviews to prevent scrutiny from accreditation boards. She spoke without emotion, laying out facts the way someone might describe the weather, each word landing like a nail in a coffin Kenneth hadn't known he was building. "That's impossible," Kenneth heard himself say, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears, unconvincing in the face of Diane's meticulous presentation. She didn't argue, simply open a laptop and turn it toward him, displaying spreadsheets that tracked every surgery, every billing code, every patient outcome in color-coded rows that painted a picture of institutional murder disguised as medical care. I have recordings of Dr. Walsh discussing her scheme with other physicians, emails directing staff to alter medical records, and my own observations of her pressuring elderly patients into surgeries while they were medicated and confused. I also documented the kickback payments, cash transfers to primary care doctors who referred patients, fancy dinners characterized as consulting fees, and direct payments hidden in hospital vendor accounts. Kenneth felt the room spinning, his carefully constructed world tilting sideways as 17 years of building an empire revealed itself as 17 years of building a house of cards on quicksand. He thought about Rebecca, remembering suddenly how insistent she'd been about firing Diane, how nervous she'd become about the cleaning lady who asked too many questions. And he felt sick with the realization that he'd been manipulated with the same casual ease he'd manipulated countless others. "I didn't know," he said, and Diane's expression shifted slightly, not to sympathy but to something like pity, which was infinitely worse. "Dr. Morrison, whether you knew or didn't know will be determined during the investigation, but right now, I need your cooperation," Chin interjected, his tone making clear that cooperation was the only thing standing between Kenneth and his own indictment. The details emerged over 3 hours that felt like 3 days. Rebecca had been running her scheme for 5 years, recruiting other physicians into fraud, building a network of corruption that infected every department she touched. The hospital's chief financial officer was involved, falsifying billing records and creating shell companies to launder kickback payments. 2 board members had accepted bribes to approve equipment purchases from vendors who kicked back 30% of their fees. Boston General, Kenneth's crown jewel, was a criminal enterprise, and he'd been too busy admiring his view and drinking expensive scotch to notice his girlfriend and colleagues turning it into a killing field for profit. "Miss Porter, you're a cleaning lady. How did you even know how to investigate all this?" Kenneth asked, the question escaping before he could stop it, revealing his fundamental assumption that people in humble positions couldn't possibly possess expertise beyond their station. Diane's laugh was short and bitter, carrying decades of being underestimated by men who'd never bothered to look beyond the surface. "Dr. Morrison, I'm not a cleaning lady. I'm a forensic accountant with a master's degree in accounting from Wharton and 10 years' experience with the FBI's healthcare fraud unit. I took the night shift at your hospital because it allowed me to be home during the day with my special needs son, and I recognized your fraud patterns within 2 weeks of starting work. The only reason I stayed as long as I did was to build a comprehensive case that would actually hold up in court rather than just getting individual doctors arrested while the system continued." Her words hit him like physical blows, each syllable destroying another piece of the comfortable story he'd been telling himself about who mattered and who didn't, who was important and who was disposable. The next 72 hours passed in a haze of lawyers, emergency board meetings, and federal investigators combing through 17 years of hospital records like archaeologists excavating layers of institutional rot. Kenneth hadn't slept, surviving on coffee and the terrible clarity that comes from watching your entire life revealed as a fiction you've been too arrogant to question. The hospital's legal team had assembled in his conference room like a war cabinet. 37 attorneys from 3 firms trying to build a defense strategy while acknowledging that the evidence was so overwhelming that cooperation was the only path that didn't end with everyone in federal prison. Outside his windows, news vans had begun gathering, reporters already running stories about an unnamed major Boston healthcare fraud case that had the city's medical establishment holding its collective breath. Rebecca hadn't returned his calls, and her lawyer had sent a terse email stating that she was exercising her Fifth Amendment rights and would not be speaking with anyone, including Kenneth, about the matter. The betrayal hurt less than he'd expected. His anger felt abstract, distant, overwhelmed by the larger catastrophe of realizing he'd built his legacy on top of crimes that had killed real people. The prosecutors had shown him patient files. An 82-year-old woman who'd gone in for back pain and died 3 weeks after Rebecca's necessary spinal fusion. A 76-year-old man whose routine procedure had severed his spinal cord, leaving him paralyzed. Families destroyed by surgeries performed for profit rather than medical need. Kenneth had signed off on Rebecca's surgical volumes, celebrated her profitability, never once asking why her patient outcomes were deteriorating while her revenue numbers soared. The board meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m., and Kenneth prepared for it with the grim acceptance of a man walking toward his own execution. He'd submitted his resignation letter that morning, effective immediately, acknowledging his failure to oversee the hospital properly even though he still desperately wanted to believe, that he hadn't known about the fraud. His attorneys had drafted a statement taking responsibility without admitting criminal liability, a legal tightrope that felt cowardly but necessary if he wanted to avoid indictment himself. The prosecutors had made clear that his cooperation was the only thing keeping him out of handcuffs, and Kenneth had spent 2 days in their office, walking them through every decision, every approval, every instance where he prioritized hospital profits over patient safety, without realizing what he was actually enabling. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Dr. Morrison, this is Diane Porter. Can we meet before the board meeting? There's something you need to understand before the arrests happen tomorrow." Kenneth stared at the message for a long moment, wondering what else there could possibly be to understand. What other catastrophes could be lurking in the ruins of his career? He texted back a time and location. A coffee shop 3 blocks from the hospital. Neutral ground where neither of them would have the advantage of familiar territory. Part of him wanted to refuse, wanted to avoid the woman whose competence had exposed everything he'd failed to see, but a larger part recognized that Diane Porter might be the only person in his orbit who was actually telling him the truth. She was already there when he arrived, sitting at a corner table with 2 cups of black coffee and an expression that suggested this conversation was going to hurt. Kenneth sat across from her, noticing details he'd missed before. The intelligence in her eyes, the quiet strength in how she carried herself, the wedding ring she still wore despite obviously being single, and the photo of a young boy she'd set on the table like a talisman against whatever darkness they were about to discuss. "Dr. Morrison, I asked you here because I wanted to understand something before tomorrow's arrests turn everything into a media circus," Diane began, her voice gentle but unyielding, a doctor delivering a terminal diagnosis with compassion but no false hope. "You're going to want to offend Rebecca, to believe she was operating independently, to imagine that you were just fooled by someone you loved. And maybe that's partially true, but I need you to see the whole picture before you commit to that narrative." She pulled out a tablet and showed him footage from security cameras, time-stamped conversations between Rebecca and other physicians discussing their fraud scheme, emails CCing him on surgical volume increases that were actually code for unnecessary procedures. "You approved the hiring of every physician Rebecca recruited into her scheme. You signed off on bonus structures that incentivized surgical volumes over patient outcomes. You ignored complaints from nurses who reported concerns about patient safety, dismissing them as union troublemaking when they tried to sound alarms." Kenneth wanted to argue, but the evidence was undeniable. He hadn't orchestrated the fraud, but he created the environment where it flourished, prioritizing growth and profit over the clinical standards that should have caught what Rebecca was doing. "I took the cleaning job at your hospital because I was desperate," Diane continued, and Kenneth heard the pain beneath her professional composure, the cost of the choices that had led her to emptying his wastebaskets while hiding credentials that eclipsed most of his executives. "I left the FBI 5 years ago to care for my son, who has autism and needs specialized support. His father walked out after the diagnosis, leaving me with medical bills and therapy costs that consumed 40% of my income. I chose night shifts because it meant I could be home during the day, present when he needed me, and I thought cleaning was honest work that would let me be the mother he deserved while still making rent." Her voice broke slightly on those last words, revealing the sacrifice she'd made, the dignity she maintained while people like Kenneth and Rebecca looked through her as if she didn't exist. "But I couldn't unsee what I was seeing. Couldn't ignore elderly patients being wheeled to operating rooms while crying because they didn't understand why they needed surgery. Couldn't pretend the numbers added up when everything in my training screamed fraud. So I documented it, knowing it would probably cost me my job, hoping someone would listen because Medicare fraud isn't victimless. It's elderly people having their spines cut open unnecessarily, families destroyed by preventable deaths, taxpayer money stolen to fund doctors' vacation homes." Kenneth felt tears burning behind his eyes, overwhelmed by the courage of this woman he'd dismissed as insignificant, humbled by her integrity compared to his own moral blindness. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Because tomorrow, 7 doctors, including Rebecca, will be arrested in coordinated dawn raids at their homes, and it's going to be on every news channel in America. The hospital is facing a $2 billion lawsuit from the families of the 17 patients who died, and there will be calls for criminal charges against you personally, even though we both know you're not being indicted right now. Your entire life is about to be defined by this scandal, and I'm giving you a choice about who you're going to be in the aftermath. Diane's eyes held his with uncomfortable intensity, seeing parts of him he'd kept hidden from everyone, including himself. You can be the entitled administrator who claims ignorance and blames everyone else, or you can be the man who takes real responsibility, cooperates fully, and uses whatever authority you're left to actually fix what's broken. She stood to leave, gathering her coffee cup and her son's photo with movements that carried exhausted grace. The board meeting is in an hour. I'll be there to present my findings. I hope you'll choose to be someone worth saving. The boardroom fell silent when Diane entered. 27 people in expensive suits suddenly confronted with the reality that the woman who destroyed their institution was neither a competitor nor an investigative journalist, but former cleaning lady they'd never bothered to notice. Kenneth watched their faces cycle through disbelief, confusion, and finally anger, as if her mere presence violated some unspoken rule about who belonged in their executive spaces. Rebecca's empty chair loomed at the table like an accusation, her absence explained by a terse announcement from her attorney that she was indisposed and exercising her constitutional rights. The hospital's chairman, Judge Arthur Carmichael, gavelled the meeting to order with the grim authority of a man presiding over an execution, gesturing for Diane to present what everyone already knew would be a catalog of institutional failure. Members of the board, my name is Diane Porter, and for 18 months I worked as a night shift custodian at this hospital. Diane began, her voice steady despite being surrounded by people who'd built their careers on intimidating others into submission. I'm also a forensic accountant with a master's degree from Wharton and 10 years of experience with the FBI's healthcare fraud unit. And I'm here to explain how Boston General Hospital became a criminal enterprise under your oversight. Kenneth saw board members bristle, heard someone mutter about lawsuits and defamation, but Judge Carmichael silenced him with a look that could have frozen water. Miss Porter has immunity and is cooperating with federal prosecutors. I suggest we listen to what she has to say before we're all dragging our lawyers into criminal proceedings instead of just civil litigation. The evidence Diane presented was devastating, not just because of what it revealed about Rebecca and the other physicians, but because it showed how many warning signs had been ignored, how many opportunities the board had missed to stop the fraud before it killed 17 people. Nurses had filed complaints about surgical complications, and those complaints had been dismissed as personnel issues. Patient families had questioned medical necessity, and those questions had been characterized as uneducated interference with physician judgment. The hospital's Quality Assurance Committee had flagged unusual mortality rates in Rebecca's cases, and those flags had been downgraded to requires monitoring without any actual intervention. At every stage, profit had trumped safety, efficiency had overridden ethics, and people in power had chosen comfort over truth. Dr. Rebecca Walsh performed 237 unnecessary spinal surgeries over 5 years, billing Medicare for $17 million in fraudulent charges. Diane explained, her presentation illuminating each case with clinical precision. She recruited 6 other physicians into her scheme, paying them kickbacks for patient referrals and falsifying medical records to justify procedures that violated clinical standards. 17 patients died as a direct result of these unnecessary surgeries. Elderly people who went into the hospital with manageable back pain and came out paralyzed, septic, or dead. Their families are filing a combined $2 billion lawsuit against the hospital, and federal prosecutors are seeking 30-year sentences for everyone involved. Kenneth watched board members turn pale, calculating their own exposure, wondering which of their decisions would be examined by federal investigators looking for evidence of knowledge or negligence. Here's what you need to understand, Diane continued, and her tone shifted from prosecutor to educator, someone trying to teach a lesson to people who desperately needed to learn it. This didn't happen because Rebecca Walsh was uniquely evil. It happened because you created a system that prioritized profit over patients, that rewarded surgical volumes without asking about necessity, that punished people who raised concerns and celebrated those who made money regardless of how they did it. Kenneth Morrison signed off on Rebecca's bonus structure, but you approve his compensation plan. Kenneth ignored nurse complaints, but you voted to approve the HR policies that made reporting concerns a career-ending move. This fraud was systemic, institutional, and you all participated in creating the environment where it could flourish. The silence that followed her words was crushing, broken only by someone's nervous cough and the distant sound of sirens that felt ominously symbolic. Judge Carmichael looked like he'd aged 10 years during the presentation, his judicial dignity unable to hide the devastation of realizing his legacy would be defined by this disaster rather than his decades of public service. "Miss Porter, what happens now?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of a man confronting consequences he couldn't escape. Diane's expression softened slightly, and Kenneth saw genuine compassion beneath her professional armor, a recognition that most of the people in this room had made mistakes rather than committed crimes. Tomorrow at 6 a.m., FBI agents will arrest Dr. Walsh and 6 other physicians in coordinated raids at their homes. The arrests will be on national news by 7, and you'll need to have a crisis communication plan ready before patients and staff arrive for morning shifts. The prosecutors are offering the hospital a deferred prosecution agreement if you cooperate fully, implement comprehensive compliance reforms, and agree to ongoing federal monitoring for 5 years. They also want you to hire me, Diane added, and Kenneth felt his heart stop at the audacity of what she was suggesting. The prosecution team believes I'm the only person with the expertise and credibility to clean up this mess. They're asking that I be appointed Director of Healthcare Compliance with full authority to investigate every department, fire any staff involved in fraud, and implement new protocols to prevent this from happening again. My salary would be $500,000 annually. I report directly to the board rather than to hospital administration, and I'd have a staff of 20 compliance officers who answer only to me. She paused, meeting each board member's eyes with unflinching intensity. I know some of you are thinking you'd rather take your chances in court than let a former cleaning lady have that much power, but I promise you, the alternative is federal indictments for everyone in this room, criminal trials that will take years, and prison sentences that will end your careers and destroy your families. The vote was unanimous, passed with the desperate speed of people trying to save themselves from drowning, hands shooting up so quickly that Kenneth almost laughed at the absurdity. 27 people who'd spent their careers accumulating power and influence now begging a woman they treated as invisible to save them from the consequences of their own negligence. Judge Carmichael formally appointed Diane as Director of Healthcare Compliance with salary and authority that exceeded most C-suite executives, and the irony was so thick Kenneth could barely breathe. "Dr. Morrison," Judge Carmichael added, turned to Kenneth with an expression mixing sympathy and finality. "Your resignation is accepted, effective immediately. Ms. Porter will be assuming oversight of the remediation process, and we'll be appointing an interim hospital director within the week." Kenneth nodded, unable to speak, watching a 17-year reign end with administrative efficiency that reduced his legacy to a line item in meeting minutes. As the board members filed out, avoiding eye contact and already calling their attorneys, Kenneth found himself alone with Diane in the empty conference room. "You're going to hate this place," he said quietly, the first honest thing he'd said to her since she'd been just a cleaning lady he could ignore. "The politics, the egos, the constant compromises. It'll grind you down until you're just like the rest of us." Diane smiled sadly, gathering her papers with practiced efficiency. "Dr. Morrison, I spent 18 months emptying your wastebaskets while watching you destroy lives of profit and convince yourself you were building something meaningful. I've already seen what this place does to people. The difference is I'm not here to build an empire or impress anyone. I'm here to make sure no more elderly patients die on operating tables they didn't need to be on. If that makes me hated by everyone in this building, I can live with that." She headed toward the door, then paused, looking back at him with something that might have been regret. "For what it's worth, I think you could have been a good doctor if you cared more about patients than your view of Boston Harbor. I hope you figure that out before it's too late." The FBI raids happened exactly as Diane had predicted, unfolding at dawn with the coordinated precision of military operation broadcast live on every news channel in New England. Kenneth watched from his Beacon Hill townhouse, standing in his bathrobe with cold coffee, while CNN showed footage of Rebecca being led from her Brookline mansion in handcuffs, her designer silk pajamas and disheveled hair making her look vulnerable in a way he'd never seen during their 5 years together. 6 other physicians were arrested simultaneously. The chief of cardiology, 2 orthopedic surgeons, a gastroenterologist, and 2 family medicine doctors who'd been feeding Rebecca their elderly patients like lambs to slaughter. The news anchors used words like unprecedented healthcare fraud and patient deaths with a breathless excitement of people who'd found a story that combined medical drama with true crime, and Kenneth felt sick watching his hospital's logo plastered across the screen, beside mugshots and allegations of systematic murder. His phone had been ringing since 5:30 a.m., but Kenneth ignored the calls from reporters, former colleagues, and friends who wanted explanations he didn't have the energy to provide. The only call he'd answer was from his mother in Vermont, her voice shaking with confusion as she tried to understand how her son, the brilliant doctor who'd escaped small-town poverty to build an empire, had ended up at the center of a scandal that made the morning news feel like watching a nightmare. "They're saying people died, Kenneth. They're saying your hospital killed 17 patients for money. Tell me that's not true." He tried to explain, tried to make her understand that he hadn't known, hadn't been indicted, was cooperating with investigators, but his words sounded hollow even to his own ears. Excuses rather than explanations, a man clinging to technical innocence while morally bankrupt. Rebecca's arraignment was scheduled for 2 p.m., and Kenneth found himself driving to the courthouse despite his lawyer's explicit instructions to stay away and maintain distance from someone who betrayed him so thoroughly. He sat in the back of the courtroom, watching federal prosecutors outline charges that carried 30 years in federal prison: healthcare fraud, conspiracy, manslaughter through medical negligence, obstruction of justice, and money laundering to the shell companies she created to hide her kickback payments. Rebecca's attorney argued for bail with the desperate creativity of someone trying to paint his client as a respected surgeon rather than a serial killer in scrubs, but the judge was unmoved by claims of community ties and professional reputation when 17 bodies undermined every word. The defendant orchestrated a 5-year scheme that resulted in the deaths of 17 elderly patients who underwent unnecessary surgeries for her financial benefit, the prosecutor stated, his voice carrying throughout the courtroom with prosecutorial certainty. She falsified medical records, intimidated staff who questioned her surgical decisions, and recruited other physicians into a fraud network. The evidence includes recordings of Dr. Walsh explicitly discussing how to manipulate Medicare billing codes, how to coach patients into consenting to unnecessary procedures, and how to handle families who question medical necessity. This was not a mistake or professional disagreement. This was systematic, intentional, and resulted in preventable deaths. The government requests that bail be denied given the severity of charges and the defendant's financial resources that make her a flight risk. Rebecca turned to look at the gallery during the prosecutor's statement, and her eyes found Kenneth's with an expression he couldn't quite read: anger, pleading, accusation, desperation, all mixed together in a woman watching her life disintegrate in real time. He wanted to feel sympathy, wanted to remember the woman he'd thought he loved, but all he could see was the 17 patient files Diane had shown him. Elderly people who trusted doctors and ended up dead or paralyzed while Rebecca bought designer clothes with money stolen from Medicare. The judge denied bail with terse efficiency, citing flight risk and danger to the community, and Kenneth watched Rebecca being led away in handcuffs, her shoulders shaking with sobs that would have moved him even a week ago, but now just felt like performance. Outside the courthouse, reporters ambushed Kenneth with questions shouted from behind microphones and cameras. Was he involved in the fraud? Did he know what Rebecca was doing? Would he be charged? How could this happen under his leadership? He pushed through them without speaking, following his lawyer's advice to maintain silence, even though part of him wanted to scream explanations and defenses that might salvage something from the wreckage of his reputation. His phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca's attorney. "She wants to see you. Says it's urgent. Visiting hours at the detention center are 6 to 8 p.m. Kenneth stared at the message for a long moment, weighing curiosity against common sense, knowing his lawyer would absolutely forbid this meeting, but unable to resist a pull of questions that needed answering. The Suffolk County House of Correction was everything Kenneth had never imagined he'd experience. Institutional beige walls, metal detectors, guards who looked at him with the weary indifference of people who'd seen every type of human failure and stopped being surprised years ago. Rebecca appeared behind bulletproof glass wearing an orange jumpsuit that transformed her from the elegant surgeon he'd known into just another inmate, her face scrubbed of makeup, her hair pulled back with none of its usual sophisticated styling. She picked up the phone on her side of the glass, and Kenneth did the same on his, both of them silent for a moment as the weight of what had happened settled between them like a third presence in the visiting room. "Kenneth, you have to help me," Rebecca started, her voice raw with tears that might have been genuine or might have been calculated. He couldn't tell anymore, couldn't trust his judgment about anything after learning how thoroughly she'd deceived him. This is all a mistake, a misunderstanding. That cleaning lady, that woman, she's lying, exaggerating, making it sound worse than it was. Yes, I performed aggressive surgeries, but that's what good surgeons do. We take risks, we push boundaries, and sometimes patients don't survive. That doesn't make it fraud or murder or whatever they're calling it. Kenneth listened to her rationalization with growing horror, recognizing the same logic he'd used to justify his own failures, the same refusal to acknowledge that good intentions don't erase bad outcomes when people die from your negligence. "Rebecca, they have recordings of you discussing the fraud." Diane documented everything, the kickbacks, the falsified records, the unnecessary surgeries. 17 patients died because you cut open their spines when they didn't need surgery, and you did it for money. His words came out harsher than intended. Anger he hadn't known he was carrying suddenly erupting in the sterile visiting room. Rebecca's expression shifted from pleading to fury, her mask slipping to reveal the coldness Diane had tried to warn him about, the ruthlessness he'd mistaken for ambition and strength. That woman ruined everything. She was supposed to be invisible, supposed to just clean and stay out of the way. But she was spying on us, recording conversations, building her little case because she's bitter about her own failed career. She's nobody, a failed accountant who couldn't handle real work. So she took a cleaning job and then betrayed everyone to feel important again. The venom in Rebecca's voice crystallized something for Kenneth, made him understand finally what Diane had been trying to teach him in that coffee shop conversation. Rebecca didn't see her crimes as crimes. She saw them as business decisions that went wrong, unfortunate outcomes that happened to interfere with career advancement. The patients weren't people to her. They were revenue streams, billing opportunities, statistics that looked good on grant applications. And Kenneth had loved her, lived with her, built his life around her precisely because she reflected back his own values. Winning mattered more than wisdom. Success trumped integrity, and people who couldn't keep up were disposable. He stood to leave, hanging up the phone while Rebecca was still talking, her accusations about Diane's motives following him as he walked away from the woman he thought he'd spent his life with and toward a reckoning he could no longer avoid. The press conference was scheduled for 10 a.m. in Boston General's main lobby, and by 9:30 the space was packed with reporters from every major news outlet in New England plus CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News sending satellite trucks that turned the hospital's entrance into a media circus. Kenneth stood backstage with Diane and Judge Carmichael, listening to the chairman's communications director rehearse talking points that would attempt to separate the hospital's institutional reputation from the criminal actions of individual physicians. Diane looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes suggesting she'd slept as poorly as Kenneth had, but her navy suit was impeccable and her demeanor carried the calm authority of someone who'd faced down worse than a crowd of aggressive reporters. "Remember, we're here to announce the hospital's cooperation with federal prosecutors, Diane's appointment as compliance director, and the comprehensive reforms we're implementing." Judge Carmichael reminded them, though his tone suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as them. "We acknowledge mistakes were made, express sympathy for the patients and families harmed, and emphasize our commitment to ensuring this never happens again. Kenneth, you're here to answer questions about oversight failures and your resignation. Diane, you're here to explain the reforms and reassure the public that we're taking this seriously." The communications director winced at that last part, clearly uncomfortable with a former cleaning lady being positioned as the institution's savior. But Diane just smiled with grim amusement at the irony. The press conference began with Judge Carmichael reading a prepared statement that hit all the expected notes: shock, disappointment, commitment to change, delivered with the somber gravitas of a man who'd spent his career crafting public statements that said everything and nothing simultaneously. Then came questions, reporters shouting over each other with the aggressive enthusiasm of people who smell blood in the water. Judge Carmichael, how could systematic fraud continue for 5 years without anyone noticing? What does this say about Boston General's oversight? The chairman deflected expertly, talking about complex systems and how fraud was designed to evade detection. But the reporters weren't satisfied, sensing evasion beneath the corporate language. Dr. Morrison, you were the hospital director for 17 years. How did you not know your girlfriend was committing systematic Medicare fraud right under your nose? The question came from a young reporter in the front row, her tone mixing professional curiosity with personal judgment that made Kenneth feel like he was being cross-examined in public court. He took a breath, remembering Diane's advice about choosing who he wanted to be in this aftermath, and decided to try honesty rather than spin. I didn't know because I didn't want to know. I prioritized revenue over patient outcomes, celebrated surgical volumes without asking about medical necessity, and ignored warning signs because investigating them would have been inconvenient. I failed every patient who died under my watch, and no amount of legal technicality changes that fundamental truth. The room went silent, reporters momentarily stunned by actual accountability instead of corporate deflection, and Kenneth felt strangely liberated by speaking truth he'd been avoiding since Diane had first shown him the evidence. I'm resigning because I don't deserve to lead this institution anymore, and I'm cooperating fully with federal prosecutors, because it's the absolute minimum I could do to help fix the damage my negligence enabled. I loved Rebecca Walsh, and that blinded me to who she actually was and what she was doing. I chose comfort over truth, and 17 people died as a result. I have to live with that for the rest of my life, and no punishment anyone can impose will be worse than what I'm already carrying. Then came the question Kenneth had been dreading. Dr. Morrison, we understand the whistleblower in this case was a cleaning lady you fired 3 months ago. Can you comment on the irony that the person who exposed the fraud was someone you dismissed as unimportant? The reporter's tone made clear she'd already written her story, already cast Kenneth as the arrogant administrator blind to the heroic worker right under his nose. And honestly, he couldn't argue because that's exactly what had happened. Diane Porter was never unimportant. I just couldn't see her value because I convinced myself that status and credentials mattered more than character and competence. I fired her because Rebecca asked me to, because Ms. Porter was asking questions that threatened to expose what was happening, and I didn't bother to wonder why anyone would feel threatened by a cleaning lady's curiosity. He paused, looking at Diane standing beside her with her carefully neutral expression, and felt the full weight of his own moral blindness. Ms. Porter is the most qualified person to lead our remediation efforts, and I'm grateful she's willing to work in an institution that treated her so poorly. Diane stepped forward, and the energy in the room shifted as reporters redirected their attention to the woman who'd brought down Boston General's leadership. Ms. Porter, you took a job as a cleaning lady despite having an MBA from Wharton and 10 years with the FBI. Why? The question came with genuine curiosity, and Kenneth watched Diane consider her response with the care of someone who knew her words would be quoted forever. I have a 9-year-old son with autism who needs specialized support, and his father abandoned us after the diagnosis. I chose a night shift cleaning position because it allowed me to be home during the day when my son needed me, and because honest work has dignity regardless of what society thinks about the title. But working as a custodian when you have advanced degrees, wasn't that a waste of your education? The reporter pressed, genuinely baffled that someone would choose parenting over career, and Diane's smile carried both patience and steel. Being present for my son is the most important work I'll ever do, and providing for him while being emotionally available required sacrifices that people with nannies and flexible careers don't have to understand. I didn't see my cleaning job as beneath me. I saw it as the option that let me be the mother my son deserved while also paying rent. The fact that I happened to notice fraud during my work was almost incidental to my primary purpose, which was making sure Noah had a parent who showed up for him every single day. The reporters pivoted to questions about the compliance reforms, federal oversight, and whether patients should trust Boston General anymore. But Kenneth barely heard them, lost in contemplation of everything Diane had sacrificed while people like him and Rebecca had been obsessed with accumulating meaningless status symbols. She'd given up a prestigious career to empty wastebaskets and mop floors because her son needed her, maintaining her dignity and competence even when everyone around her treated her as invisible. And when she'd recognized fraud, she documented it with the meticulous care of someone who understood that truth mattered more than comfort, that protecting vulnerable patients justified risking the financial security she'd already sacrificed so much to maintain. The press conference ended after 45 minutes, and Kenneth walked out through a side exit to avoid the crowd of reporters still shouting questions. His phone buzzed with messages from friends and colleagues, some supportive, most distancing themselves from someone whose career had just imploded on national television. He should have felt devastated, humiliated, destroyed by the public exposure of his failures. But instead, he felt strangely light, like he'd been carrying something heavy for years and finally set it down. The truth about Boston General was now public. The lies that had sustained his empire were exposed, and Kenneth Morrison was no longer a powerful hospital director, but just a man who'd made terrible mistakes and had to figure out how to do better. 6 months later, Kenneth stood in the back of Boston General's main auditorium, watching Diane present the hospital's compliance reforms to a packed room of medical staff who'd initially resisted her authority, but gradually recognized her competence and integrity. She fired 37 employees involved in the fraud, implemented new protocols that separated billing decisions from clinical ones, and brought in federal auditors who found another dozen schemes beyond Rebecca's systematic surgeries. The hospital's reputation had taken a brutal hit. Patient volumes had dropped 30%, and several board members had resigned under pressure, but Boston General was rebuilding as something better than it had been, an actual healthcare institution, rather than a profit machine disguised as one. Kenneth had spent those 6 months in a kind of professional purgatory, not charged with crimes, but unemployable in hospital administration. His reputation too damaged to trust with leadership positions, even though he cooperated fully with prosecutors. He'd sold his Beacon Hill townhouse and moved to a modest condo in Cambridge, using the equity to donate $5 million to a victim compensation fund for the families of patients who died from Rebecca's unnecessary surgeries. His mother had visited twice, the first time to cry over his fall from grace, the second time to tell him she was proud that he'd chosen honesty over ego even when it cost him everything. He'd started volunteering at a free clinic in Dorchester, seeing patients again after years of pure administration, remembering why he'd wanted to be a doctor before ambition had consumed him. He'd also been seeing Diane, first professionally as they coordinated his testimony for the ongoing criminal trials, then personally when he started bringing coffee to her office during her 14-hour workdays, and eventually romantically when they both acknowledged a connection neither had been looking for but couldn't deny. She'd been skeptical initially, worried that he was just replacing Rebecca with a new obsession, but Kenneth had proved through 6 months of consistent presence and humble support that he'd actually changed. He showed up for Noah's school events, learned about autism support strategies, helped Diane balance her crushing workload with her need to be present for her son, and never once made her feel like she should be grateful he was choosing her despite their history. Today was special. The Joint Commission's National Review Team was presenting Boston General with a Healthcare Excellence Award, recognizing the hospital's transformation under Diane's leadership as a model for institutional reform. Federal prosecutors had cited her work in their recommendations for sentencing Rebecca and the other physicians, noting that comprehensive compliance systems prevented future crimes more effectively than simply punishing past ones. Rebecca herself had been sentenced to 28 years in federal prison after rejecting a plea deal that would have reduced her time to 15, choosing to go to trial, and losing spectacularly when Diane's meticulous evidence convinced a jury in under 4 hours. The other physicians had accepted plea deals ranging from 5 to 12 years, and several board members were still fighting civil lawsuits from patients' families. Thanks to Director Porter's leadership, Boston General has implemented the most comprehensive healthcare compliance system in the United States, the Joint Commission representative was saying, his voice carrying genuine admiration that made Kenneth smile with pride for the woman who'd saved an institution that had tried to crush her. Her protocols are being studied by hospitals across the country as a model for how to prevent fraud while maintaining quality patient care. More importantly, she's created a culture where staff feel empowered to report concerns without fear of retaliation, where clinical decisions are protected from financial pressures, and where patient safety is truly the first priority rather than just marketing language. The auditorium erupted in applause, and Kenneth watched Diane accept the award with the gracious humility of someone who'd never done this for recognition, but couldn't help being moved by it anyway. After the ceremony, Kenneth found Diane in her office, the award sitting on her desk next to the photo of Noah that went everywhere with her. "You did it," he said simply, and she laughed with exhausted joy. "We did it. You testified at every trial, helped implement reforms, donated money when you absolutely didn't have to. You showed up, Kenneth, and that matters. She stood and kissed him, the gesture still feeling slightly miraculous after 6 months, and Kenneth marveled at how different she felt from Rebecca. Diane's warmth was real, earned through character rather than performance, and her love felt like coming home rather than winning a prize. Noah wants to know if you're coming to dinner tonight. He's made a list of things we need to discuss, including why you still haven't learned to play his favorite video game properly. I'll be there, Kenneth promised, meaning it with every part of himself, grateful for the second chance at a life that mattered. They left the hospital together, walking through lobbies where patients received actual care instead of unnecessary procedures, where staff felt safe reporting concerns, where the goal was healing rather than profit. Kenneth had lost almost everything, his career, his reputation, his wealth reduced from millions to a comfortable but modest existence, and somehow ended up with more than he'd ever had when he'd been powerful. He had Diane, who saw him clearly and loved him anyway, and Noah, who had accepted him into their small family with a matter-of-fact trust children give to adults who show up consistently and treat them with respect. 6 weeks later, they were married in Boston General's Chapel, the small ceremony attended by hospital staff who'd watched their unlikely romance develop and approved of how the disgraced former director had transformed into someone worth Diane's remarkable heart. Noah served as ring bearer, carrying the rings with ritualistic precision that made Diane cry with maternal pride. Judge Carmichael officiated, calling their marriage a symbol of redemption and second chances, of how people can change when they face their failures with honesty. Kenneth's mother sat in the front row, finally at peace with her son's choices, understanding that he'd found more meaning in this humble chapel ceremony than he'd ever had during black-tie galas and board meetings. They honeymooned in Vermont, introducing Noah to the small town where Kenneth had grown up, showing him community his grandfather had served through decades of family medicine. Kenneth's father had died years earlier, never forgiving his son for choosing ambition over service. But Kenneth felt his presence somehow as they walked through the town where people still remembered Dr. Morrison Sr. with genuine affection. He told Diane and Noah stories about house calls on winter nights, about his father treating patients who paid in eggs and homemade jam, about medicine practice with humility and care that put people over profit. He was right and I was wrong, Kenneth admitted, and Diane squeezed his hand with understanding that didn't require words. 3 months after the wedding, Diane stood in Kenneth's Cambridge condo bathroom staring at a positive pregnancy test with shock and joy and terror all mixed together. Kenneth found her there, tears streaming down her face, and held her while she processed the miracle and complexity of carrying a child when she already struggled to balance Noah's needs with her demanding career. "We'll figure out," he promised, meaning it completely, already imagining how they'd reorganize their lives to accommodate a baby while making sure Noah felt secure and loved. They told Noah together, showing him the ultrasound photo and explaining that he'd be a big brother, and his response, "Will the baby like action figures? Because I have 37 and I could share some," made them both laugh until they cried. The baby girl was born 7 months later in Boston General Hospital, delivered by physicians Diane had hired as part of the compliance reforms, surrounded by staff who become family through shared purpose. Kenneth held his daughter with wonder that eclipsed anything he'd felt during his years of building an empire, marveling at how something so small could contain so much possibility and love. Diane looked exhausted and radiant. Noah standing beside the bed, counting his new sister's fingers and toes with mathematical precision, and Kenneth understood finally what success actually meant. Not corner offices or profit margins or influential friends, but this, a small hospital room filled with people who loved each other and showed up when it mattered. The Joint Commission's award sat in Diane's office, proof of transformation and redemption, but a real evidence of their shared future lay in this moment. Kenneth Morrison, former hospital director who'd lost everything and gained what mattered, holding his newborn daughter while his stepson explained the importance of establishing proper sleeping schedules, and his wife smiled with the satisfied exhaustion of someone who'd saved an institution, built a family, and proved that underdog stories sometimes end with both justice and love. The complete American dream realized through humility, sacrifice, and the simple courage to show up every single day for the people who need you most.